Hi everyone, I want to talk about some tips and tricks that I can share for the inner monk to help you with your high GR pushes and farming. So I've been doing this quite a lot with my hardcore monk here. I have been clearing GR150s a few times now. So far we have gotten down to a 944 clear, so that's pretty nice. And actually ever since my first GR150 clear, I have not failed a single GR ever again. So this includes GR150s. I've done like maybe 5 runs or so when I was just leveling gems. So I have like a bunch here in my stash that I just like kept leveling. I have like a bunch of 150 traps and strickens and all these kind of things here lying around everywhere that I have just been like solo leveling all the way from usually like 138 and then all the way up to 150. So there are definitely a few little things that you can use to your advantage when playing this build, and I want to go over them with some actual examples so that you can kind of see what I'm doing, and that might help you for your own pushes perhaps. My character right now is Paragon 2900, so I'm already quite strong with this. This is solo self-found, hardcore, so I have not really been doing any bounties to gear up. This was mostly just farmed from drops, and you can see my gear, it's pretty solid. It's nothing super spectacular, I guess, especially the weapons could be better, but the rest is pretty good. And well, most of the stuff is acquired quite easily anyway, besides maybe the rings and the amulet. So this is my setup here. I'm running the Oculus version at this point, so it's a bit more squishy, but when you play around with the Inner Sanctuary and the Serenity, then you will be fine, and you can relatively reliably survive. So far I haven't ripped with my push monk at all, and I'm usually not really in danger very much. On softcore, you wouldn't need a near-death experience, so you could like do this with like a few hundred less paragons if you go, for example, for Unity, and you can take some other risks. So maybe you can consider my character like something around 2.5k or so on softcore. So that much for the intro. Here I've written down a few points for the things I want to go over, and just to give you a bit of an idea of what the topic is going to be. And I will try to show you in some actual recording of what this actually looks like, because if I make a guide, then yeah, it's kind of hard to go into these little details here, because we have to talk about the setup and how to play the game in general. But here we can maybe go a bit more into details of how I press my buttons and when and how I move around. So this is what I'm trying to do. So the first thing is the defensive cooldowns. So when you play with this Oculus version, it's pretty much required to go Serenity plus Inner Sanctuary. I know some people like Epiphany, but I do not recommend this at all because it's simply inconsistent. You don't have anywhere close to permanent uptime. You usually don't even have close to 50% uptime. So you have it for one rotation and not for the other. And this is obviously pretty terrible in my opinion. So instead, you go with Serenity and you go with Inner Sanctuary and you have consistent damage reduction on every single nuke. And you don't need to have damage reduction while you're preparing the pull, because you will have your Traveler's Pledge on defense, and you will just not really be hit very much while moving around anyway. So usually you just need to tank enemies while you are preparing for your nuke. You can see here, for example, that my my Traveler's Pledge and this walk combo is already at 70 stacks for offensive. So I have very little damage reduction from it, and we are in the cold cycle. So this is usually the time for you to stand still and stack up the Ender's Walk buff. And in this case, you have to press your defensive cooldowns. I usually press Serenity first, because this allows you to get an extra stack of the Terror Shard from the helm and get a bit more extra damage from the 5% attack speed and crit you're gonna get from the Terror Shard, and also the extra stack in general. And this only works when Serenity is cooling down, not when it's still active. So you have to press Serenity first. Usually I do this like between the physical, mid-physical cycle, and then use Serenity afterwards to have both skills on cooldown. You can see this here right now in action. You see Serenity is cooling down. Oh, we actually have a channeling pile here. But basically the idea is that Serenity comes on cooldown somewhere during the cold cycle, and then you press Inner Sanctuary as well to protect yourself and also your Mystic allies and get both skills on cooldown. So I can show this like one more time, maybe without the channeling pylon. And you see here, it's physical. I press my Serenity at some point, and now we stand still as much as possible, get the Ender's Walk buff, I press Inner Sanctuary, and we press Mystic Allies, and boom. So here you have the full 4 stacks of the Terror Shard. This also includes the Dashing Strike, In case you were not aware, you need 1 charge on cooldown on a dashing strike, so it's fine to just dash once. You don't need to completely deplete them, so you can save 1 to escape. Another advantage of doing it this way is that the Inner Sanctuary also protects your Mystic allies from CC effects. So for example, when you fight knockback packs or nightmarish packs and frozen, it can actually happen that your Mystic allies get CC'd and don't actually do their thing. So when you have the Inner Sanctuary up and everything is standing in it, then your Mystic allies will actually be reliable and not be CC'd or anything. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the Cyclone strike after boom. So basically the idea here is that you press your Mystic allies at usually around the start of the fire convention, and then you get a few explosions like right away, like a half second or so after, but some of them will not always explode immediately, and they instead get stuck, or the targets they wanted to go for are already dead, and then they have to run around and get something else. And you can use this to advantage and use those leftover Mystic allies to actually kill more stuff. So this is what I do here. So typically I try to avoid Cyclone striking too much, to not apply crowd control resistance to the enemies, and instead I Cyclone strike them in immediately as the first enemies start dying. I can see this here in action. I can maybe reduce the speed here a little bit, so let's make this a bit slower. And you can see this here. I press the Mystic allies here, it's the start of fire, and then we get the explosions. And now I will start Cyclone striking. And you see here, I pull stuff in as the guys are popping off, and basically I kill more enemies with that, because my allies will not run to the outside and then pop on like one single enemy somewhere in the corner, but instead they will have the tightly stacked enemies just like they did on the actual first explosion, and you can get more progression done in the same explosion. So obviously on the higher tiers is not really that crazy, because you don't usually just completely annihilate the entire pool, but especially when you go for a bit lower tiers, let's say 140 or something like this, then you can definitely easily one-shot even packs, and especially trash monsters very easily. So in that case you can just have your Cyclone strike ready when you press the Mystic ally button, and then you spam it like 2-3 times very quickly to pull everything in as your Mystic allies go off. And like this you get a bunch of extra progression, and it just speeds up the runs. Here's another example of one of these pulls. So again, you see here we are about to pop off with the fire rotation coming up. And now look at my assimilation stacks here. So my generator has 19 stacks of assimilation, and this is a pretty big damage buff. So in this case we get 95% additive damage. So we are getting something like an 60% bonus or so overall, which is obviously a lot of DPS. And the thing is that all this is dynamic, so that when your Mystic allies go off and you either lose the buff or you replace it with a smaller buff, you will deal less damage. So usually when you start popping the entire pool, then you will keep punching and you will have fewer stacks for the remaining explosions. And again, similar to those leftover explosions that you're trying to use from the Cyclone strike, you can also not punch anymore to not replace the assimilation stacks. So basically right before you press your Mystic allies, you will apply assimilation one more time to have the buff for 5 seconds, and then this will be long enough for all your Mystic allies to explode with the full damage buff. So let's see this again here in action. You can see I press Mystic allies here and I get one more assimilation update, and then I do not replace my assimilation stacks until the entire fire rotation is over, and instead I mostly Cyclone strike to get the explosions with the full buff. So basically you want to stop punching and you want to Cyclone strike, and like this you deal more damage overall. Because otherwise what happens is that you replace your assimilation stacks with a much smaller stack, because most of the pool is dead, and then you deal 30%, 50% less damage or something like that. Here's another trick that I use sometimes, not really too often, but it's the dash into Oculus. So sometimes you actually manage to spawn Oculus wings just from punching enemies, especially on the lower tiers, let's say below GR140 or so. You can definitely just kill some small enemies with the punches from your Mystic allies and not actually pressing the button, especially when you also get the Shenlong buff at some point along the way. But in general you can also use this during the explosions, so you can just press Mystic allies, and as soon as the first guys go off you do the Cyclone strike thing that I just explained, and then you can also immediately walk or dash into a nearby Oculus ring and get a few more explosions off with the leftover allies from that point. So here's like one of these examples where an Oculus ring spawned actually, and I used that. I pressed the button. So here it was actually right before the fire cycle, so this is perfect. So I press the button and I dash over there, and exactly here as they all go off, I'm in the Oculus and everything explodes. And I basically one-shot the entire blue pack. So this obviously is very nice, but most of the time you will not get an Oculus ring just from punching stuff, on the higher tiers at least. And instead you can try to make use of this while your explosions are going off. Here's an example of this on the next explosion, and you see that the Oculus ring spawns right here on the left, and I still have some of the Mystic Allies not yet exploded, so I could immediately dash over or walk over because it's just a few steps. You see me actually trying to do this, but then I realized that basically the entire pool is gone anyway, and I just move on. But in some larger pools you can definitely use this to your advantage and get more damage out of this for at least some of the explosions when you see an Oculus ring spawning. But you should generally not try hard too much. At least when the Oculus ring spawns too far away, then you actually run the risk of like biking out your allies if you just dash over and then they teleport with you, and you don't really want to like go half a screen away or so. But if it's like nearby, right next to you, so something like this here, this is perfect. You can just like go over there, and you see again I'm trying to like stutter step over there, and if you are really fast you can also just dash in and get a bit more damage. Okay, one other example I want to talk about is the channeling pylons. The channeling pylons, they can do double explosions in one COE, and this is actually very useful to also squeeze out a bit more time. So here you see that I'm about to go into the cold cycle, and we have the channeling pylon here, and basically what I do is I do my rotation as early as possible. So I press it like half a second or so before the fire cycle, and then I click the channeling pylon and immediately Cyclone strike to apply the Binding Successor Gods debuff to the elite that pops out to get explosions on it, and I do another rotation at the same time. So you're gonna see this here in slow motion. So I'm preparing the pull, I am getting my simulation stacks, Cyclone striking, I have my Serenity, my Nasank, everything on cooldown, but it doesn't really matter because it resets anyway. Here we press the Mystic Ally, you see it's like half a second to fire, and we click the pylon and we Cyclone strike, you see? And this guy is already taking a lot of damage. And now you see I also pressed Mystic Ally again to get the second round of explosions, and this guy just immediately pops and we get 5% progress from that. So this is a really nice like little trick you can use with channeling pylons, the double boom. So I typically always wait until the fire cycle comes up to click them to make sure I get this double explosion, because it's actually quite valuable. And afterwards obviously you can use the channeling pylon to your advantage to just constantly deal damage all the time. So especially on the lower tiers you can usually just blast down whatever you find, because you just do a pop every 4 seconds or something like that, and you'll just deal a lot of damage. In those cases you can also make use of Oculus rings much more reliably. You can use or make use of the dashing strike to just skip maps that are terrible and stuff like that. You can usually just blast down trash. Obviously here a combo like channeling and power is pretty nasty. It can be a bit difficult to manage your Shenlongs with this high pace of you know, just completely annihilating everything. So you gotta be a bit careful there and actually still punch enough to keep your resources high to not lose a Shenlong's buff. But for the most part this is actually not really so bad. Just make sure you don't Cyclone strike too much and so you punch enough to then fill your resources all the time with the Shenlongs. Another little trick in the same category is also the dash and Cyclone combo. So typically when you have a pull that you're completely overkilling, especially with power pylons or even in speedruns. So in speedruns I do this actually a lot more often, but I haven't really done any of those recently. So I can't really show it so well right now. But you can just use your leftover Mystic Allies and dash to the next pack and immediately Cyclone strike to still get the explosion. So obviously this mostly makes sense if you still have COE and Shenlong buff, so they only have like a window of like a second or two maybe to actually do this. But in the end, basically when you know that the pull is gonna die, like this here, I press the button and this is 142, this guy is almost gone anyway. I could immediately dash down to like the bottom left, for example, to continue to the next pack, and then use like 10 or so of my Mystic Allies that still haven't exploded to also deal damage on the next pull. So here, for example, I dashed to this corner, and if I had done a Cyclone strike here, I could have gotten more progression for free, basically. Here's another thing that I use to my advantage is Stricken stacking on elites. So typically, Bane of the Stricken doesn't really help you much in the Rift on basically every build in the game, and it's usually only good for the Rift Guardian because you only apply one stack per attack to one target hit. So typically the first target hit. And almost every build in the game is an AoE build, so you have no control over where you stack Stricken in a large pool, so it's effectively worthless. But here you have the Inner Monk and you have the punches, and you can actually use those as pretty much a single target ability to stack Stricken on a target you want to stack it on. And you have extremely high attack speed on top of it, so with Flying Dragon Uptime you can get 5 Stricken stacks a second, which is 11.5% increased damage taken per second of stacking when you have Flying Dragon up. And even without Flying Dragon you can apply 5-6% increased damage taken per second. So obviously while you're waiting for your COE cycle, you can sometimes just keep punching the same elite for like 5 seconds, 10 seconds and apply something like 20, 30, 50% extra damage taken, which is quite helpful on blasting down those yellow packs. You can see this here in action. So basically what I do is I walk into this room, I find this yellow, and I try to not get too many enemies on top of the yellow so that I mostly hit the yellow and not any of the trash monsters with my punches. So I see here, most of the stuff is like somewhere on the bottom here, and I just keep punching into the direction of the yellow. And obviously some of my hits and some of my Stricken stacks will go to those ghouls here and these kind of things. But for the most part, I am punching the yellow only here for like 5 seconds straight. And then I do my rotation. You see I have all my buffs up, I press my basic allies, and I will completely one-shot this yellow here in one go on a 143. I have done one-shots on even higher tiers than that without pylons, so the effect is definitely noticeable, but obviously you can't always do this. For example, now this yellow here is like stuck in the middle of a lot of stuff, and you don't really have to try hard to try to stack Stricken here, because you will lose a lot of Stricken stacks to some other targets around. But every now and then you do find these opportunities to stack Stricken on an elite, and this is exactly what I'm doing here sometimes, even in these tiers here where, you know, it's not really such a big deal. But it does help a bit to try to blast down those packs. And you see this guy actually survives with like 30% or so. So if I had stacked a bit of Stricken on him for, let's say, 5 seconds, he would have basically also been annihilated in one go anyway. So obviously this always depends a little bit on like the scenario that you are in. When there's like a lot of these little small trash monsters and they're already like, you know, clumped around you or clumped around the elites, then you don't really have to worry that much. Or when you spend a lot of time actually trying to find the next pack and you barely have any time left to prepare your setup, then you also can't really do this. But you can see here again that, for example, we click the pylon here and I also get an Oculus wing, and I just use those like 2-3 seconds while waiting for the cycle to actually just punch in the direction of the yellow and stack maybe a bit of Stricken. You know, even like 10% extra damage is almost 1 tier worth of extra DPS, and mostly you care about the damage on the yellows because you're mostly elite hunting. So this is very useful, and you see we also annihilate this guy through the Oculus explosion, and this is 145. And lastly, one thing I already talked about in other videos is the Flying Dragon uptime. So Flying Dragon can double your damage done with your Mystic Allies when it's active, but there's no UI indicator for it. So the only reliable way of checking for your Flying Dragon uptime is through your character sheet and looking at your sheet DPS. So whenever it procs, you basically double it, but it also changes depending on your assimilation stacks, so don't get fooled by having too many assimilation stacks. But typically it's quite easy to see when it doubles and when it's not doubled. Depending on the pool size, you get a feeling for, you know, what the number should be, and then you can quite reliably tell when it's active. So Flying Dragon, you need to know, has a 4% chance to proc on any action, including dash, punch, cyclone strike, whatever, talking to an NPC even, and it lasts 7 seconds and has a 5-second cooldown. So while it's active, you actually have a 2-second window to re-proc it, and you can quite easily re-proc it sometimes because you already do more actions per second from having the double APS. But in general, at least while I was still like, you know, hard pushing toward this 150 here, this is from like my initial push on the season start on day 2 or whatever that was, day 3. And here I regularly checked my Flying Dragon uptime. You see here I have 30 million sheet damage with 20 assimilation stacks, and this means I have Flying Dragon up, because without Flying Dragon it would be like 15 million or so. And this is also where I try to time my explosions a little bit. So sometimes I press it like right at the start of fire, sometimes I pressed it maybe like 2 seconds in fire already. So this is kind of like the last point where you want to press it. So, but you have a bit of like a window here to press the button do get more damage and try to maybe proc the Flying Dragon when you know it's not active. Or for example, you see that sometimes Flying Dragon procs very early. Let's say Flying Dragon procs somewhere in the middle of your physical cycle, and then you know you have 7 seconds from there to get the explosions off. So in this case, you would try to press the Mystic Allies very early in your fight cycle to make sure that you are still in that 7-second window. So this is another little trick to use to your advantage to just get more damage on some of your booms. Especially on the Rift Guardian fight, you have a bit more like opportunity to like play around this, because most Rift Guardian fights are quite static, and you don't really have to worry about your survival or your Serenity timing out and these kind of things. And you basically just mostly stand there and punch, and then you just try to use it to your advantage as much as possible there. And that's also it for this video. So I have talked about my GR140 clear, the one that I've done at the start of the season, in another video with a full commentary of the run and also more explanations and details about the rotation and these kind of things. But I didn't really mention in so much detail with like a showcase the things I showed here. So I hope this helps you, and you can do your own gem up runs or level 150 push more easily yourself. I didn't always find the best examples here now for this video, but I tried to kind of like highlight the things I'm doing to give like the idea. In any case, I wish you good luck on your own runs. Hope this helps you. Hope you liked the video, and I'll see you guys next time.